Hi, and welcome to this talk called Sexual Dynamic Polarity as a Magical Formula, Aleister Crowley's views on gender and transcendence. I hope that you will find it interesting and entertaining. When talking about Aleister Crowley's views on sex and sexuality, you could absolutely say that he was ahead of his times. And that was true of him as a person too, of course. On many levels, he was a synthesizing occult pioneer who initiated changes that would later become very important. Of course, he wasn't an isolated force during this general liberalization of the 20th century. There were many individuals, things, and movements that opened up many radical developments. Crowley's own environment and background, post-Victorian and bourgeois, wasn't only attacked by him, but also slightly earlier by Oscar Wilde and his lover Alfred Douglas. Their public scandal brought forth stronger reverberations than those Crowley would later create, much to his disdain and frustration, of course. But this scandal was an interesting development at the time, as it broke not only sexual conventions, but also other more deeply rooted ones, specifically in an audacious visibility in the public sphere. A certain sexual tolerance towards the cultural sphere has always existed, even in Great Britain. But if you cross more lines than the accepted quota, so to speak, there will be conflict. But out of conflict, something new and vital always arises. The First World War was obviously a revolutionary force. The effects of 4 years of brutal war on European soil created an ever faster swinging pendulum movement between a strongly defined and developed liberalism on one hand and a strong and elaborate totalitarianism in communism, National Socialism on the other. Women's liberation and their right to vote spread quickly in the democratic countries. A woman as a distinct member of society was now suddenly a force to be reckoned with. For Crowley, who was born in 1875, this surely meant positive feelings on a philosophical level, but perhaps slightly less so in the private sphere. Crowley's attitude towards women were about as complex as he himself was in general. And when it came to abstracted individuals in a philosophical context, every man and every woman was a star, with the potential to find out his or her own voice and will. But when it came to his own relationships, things were, as it's nowadays called, complicated. To a great degree, Crowley worked within a utilitarian mindframe, especially from the 1910s and onwards. Regardless if we talk about longer relationships or brief rendezvous, Crowley literally wanted to use women as ejaculators of energies that can be directed and create new life in different forms, way, way beyond the conventions of petit bourgeois sexuality. For him, everything was ritual, regardless if the sexual partner in question was aware of it or not. In Crowley's central text, Liber Al, or Book of the Law, there are many references to sexual mysteries and an all-encompassing new set of morals. At the time of the writing of this allegedly channeled text, Crowley wasn't initiated into sexual mysteries as such. The text confused and attracted him at the same time. But he did have an intuitive comprehension of how magic works, and he, according to himself at least, was a magical natural force that had appeared in order to change this planet's destiny in overturning ways. But it wasn't until the 1910s, when he had been in touch with the German fraternal order Ordo Templi Orientis, or O.T.O, that he and this group could create a synthesis of what both parties were interested in: sexual magic. Liberal is a cryptic text, difficult to interpret, and furthermore with an official decree that only Crowley, in his position as scribe, is really allowed to interpret it. And the book consists of 3 chapters, each one clothed in Egyptian terminology. The first chapter, dedicated to the goddess Nuit, describes infinite cosmic potential. In this potential there is pleasure, beauty, and attractional force, but it's not tangible or perceivable before you have a direction, a goal. This constitutes chapter 2, dedicated to Hadith, not to be confused with Hadith, the Muslim prophet Muhammad's moral codex. When Nuit and Hadith meet in union, there is Rahur Kuit, which traditionally is an aspect of the main solar deity Ra. In this union exists an aggressive energy with the power both to create and destroy. This trio is what constitutes magical potential in Crowley's cosmology. In the text, there is implicitly a formulation or formula that replaces previous magical formula stemming from Judeo-Christian sources. And this is called 0 equals 2, or by simple mathematical logic, 2 equals 0. Crowley explained it like this: every act of love under will has the dual result: 1. The creation of a child combining the qualities of its parents. 2. The withdrawal by ecstasy into nothingness. End quote. Just as division of a unity leads to 2 parts, these 2 parts can create not only a new unity, but also a dissolution in and through the unity in question. Where classic magical formula making up until then had been built on a literally familiar order of succession, Yod He Vav He, father, mother, son, daughter, new life, we can now see a considerably more Asian attitude in Crowley's mind. And most of us are aware of both on instinctive and personal levels that sex is the most potent form of energy that a human being can experience. There is not only the possibility to create new human life, but also, at the moment of orgasm, to be an active part of a transcendental experience without comparison. Sex has always been present in magical and religious contexts as a very fundamental part, either as liberating or enslaving, depending on the society, culture, or reigning power structure in question. And there were other interesting things going on at this time than Crowley's awakenings and enviable Oscar Wilde scandals. Within physics, the terms fusion and fission were clarified and codified. That is, the setting free of energy in the interaction of atoms, either through merging or splitting. Put simply, the stronger the attraction is between or within atoms, the stronger the energy set free in the meeting. Danish scientist Niels Bohr's work with establishing what was to be called quantum mechanical principles in the energy flows of atoms led to his Nobel Prize in 1922. German scientist Carl Heisenberg was another giant who received the Nobel Prize in 1932 for the development of quantum mechanics. The relationship between quantum mechanics and magic as a proto-science is so strong that you can almost say that it doesn't appear to be random, that both magic and radical physics developed so quickly and in such a parallel way during the early 20th century. We can talk about it on a human existential level, on a micro level in atomic perspectives, and on a larger cosmic level. The sun and the stars simply exist and generate so much energy that it makes our lives possible and facilitates my sitting here talking and you listening. Crowley was well aware of these fundamental scientific basics and often referred to a scientific empirical method in his works. He also called his system solar phallic. The sun is in many ways the highest divine principle, and it's fueled by fusion energy. The highest tangible level or mirroring within the human being of this solar phallic power is sex, and its main representative, according to Crowley, the male sexual organ. However, this is not synonymous with phallic worship, which has been a consistent part of human religious history. The interesting thing from a magico-anthropological perspective is that phallic worship seemed to cease as humans left a holistic attitude within fertility cults and natural religions, not seldom containing hermaphroditic ideals, in favor of a dualism in which man is regarded as active and woman passive. Decidedly an Abrahamic monotheistic metaphor for power structures rather than sexual dynamics per se. Crowley formulated that the emerging eon was in need of new magical systems. He wrote, quote, "The true magic of Horus requires the passionate union of opposites," end quote. And this also goes well beyond the merely sexual metaphor. Passionate doesn't necessarily mean loving or even benevolent. Big political cataclysms during which opponents clash often lead to constructive third side solutions, either through compromise or unexpected quantum leaps. And they can certainly be passionate. It is within the unique moment where diametrical forces clash that energy is set free. And if you have insight, understanding, and respect, it's absolutely possible to direct this energy towards new goals. Crowley felt overwhelmed by liberal, the book of the law, meaning honor and duty bound, obligated to interpret the mysteries of the text. His entire magical work and authorship would soon focus on the creation of Thelema, a philosophy stemming from liberal. And that's basically how it continued all the way up until his death in 1947. The O.T.O contained a more concrete structure which attracted Crowley, and the sources of the group's teachings and mysteries have later been criticized for being not only mystical but also mythical. According to this possible myth, the order received both textual sources and oral teachings and initiations from Asia via the Middle East. These thoughts or streams were in no way new, but rather signs of a budding cosmopolitan knowledge and interest at the end of the 19th century, via an opening up of Asia Minor as well as Asia Major. Perhaps this was in many ways a romanticized current, but that in no way makes the phenomenon less substantial or valid. The O.T.O quickly became an attractive fraternity among Freemasons, who were lured in by the sexual mysteries themselves, but also by the pretty relevant fact that here even women were allowed initiation. Eventually, a synthesis of both parts was created, a German organization with a distinctly Freemasonic, albeit open-minded, structure, and the chaotic great beast Crowley's Thelema philosophy and its magical excellence. The books Hymns to the Goddess and Tantra of the Great Liberation, written by Arthur Avalon, or John Woodruff as his real name was, both published in 1913, brought in Hindu magical aspects to Western minds. Then slightly later, Shakti and Shakta from 1918 and The Serpent Power, 1919, carried on Avalon's popularization of terms or notions like Tantrism and Kundalini Yoga. And another parallel strain was the German Richard Wilhelm, whose translations from the Chinese were relevant in this context. His Secret of the Golden Flower was published in English in 1931 with an introduction by Carl Jung, and was an important insight into sexual aspects of Taoism. Taoism had become increasingly important for Crowley after a specifically Taoist epiphany or illumination in America in 1918. He said, quote, "Whoever seeks eternal life must search for the place whence human nature and life originally sprang," end quote. Crowley's integration of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, maybe did not have a distinctly sexual importance, but it's indicative of an openness to cultures whose work with sexual magical techniques had up until this time been fairly unknown or mythical. It was as if the time was now ripe for universal secrets concerning proto-generative energies to emerge from the depths and be reformulated by Westerners, either through translations like Wilhelm or synthesis like Crowley and the O.T.O. This didn't necessarily mean instant explanations of everything for an unenlightened mass of people, but definitely an availability of material and thereby an opportunity for proper studies. Crowley's Gnostic Mass, written in 1913, became central in his life and system within the O.T.O, and it still is. The idea was that this ceremony would be as central within the O.T.O and Thelema as the Catholic Mass within the Roman Catholic Church. For Crowley and his followers, the ceremonial performance of an intimate act loaded with sexual symbolism and secrets from many different esoteric traditions became a celebration of the proto-generative force in a sublime and aestheticized form. Crowley, who was scientifically inclined, was also concerned that he, quote, would neither make nor imply any statement about nature which would not be endorsed by the most materialistic man of science, end quote. One section in the Gnostic Mass is the honoring of what Crowley called the Gnostic saints. This is a long and thorough list of mythical and actual persons who directly or most often indirectly helped out with the development of Thelema. Remarkably, the list only consists of men, which has led to many interesting debates and discussions within the Thelemic environment or community. Should one here simply regard Crowley as a child of his times, or was he actually just a male chauvinist pig? Or could it possibly be, as has been claimed, that the potential of women lies far beyond and above these worldly men's destinies and manifestations? In an aggressively gender-baiting intellectual climate like ours, it's not surprising that this issue stirs up emotions. But at the same time, it's easy to see who is actually placed on the altar in the ceremony and who is worshipped not only as a concrete life giver but also as a metaphorical catalyst for all creation. Perhaps this is best expressed in the famous words of wisdom. Si quid vis dici roga virum, si quid vis frieri roga feminam, or if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. Quote by Margaret Thatcher. The list of possible female Gnostic saints could of course be quite long. Perhaps it would not contain Margaret Thatcher, but most definitely the woman who uttered Utrum manuballistulam in sino fers an quod me vides leteris, or is that a gun you have in your pocket, or are you just glad to see me? Mae West. Sexual insights, techniques, and rituals were incorporated in the existing hierarchical degree system of the O.T.O. Crowley explored all of this intensely after he had received a carte blanche to study the degrees and also to develop them. In this fervent work, as not only a magician, but now also a sex magician, Crowley naturally needed someone to work with. And perhaps his German Freemason brothers weren't the most attractive candidates in this sexual context. The need for willing women became clear and urgent. Women who were either attracted by the great beast in Crowley, by his reputation, or who simply didn't have a clue what was going on the astral planes during these cosmic sexual congresses. For Crowley, who in his bisexuality was a submissive homosexual, it was natural to experiment with homosexual energies within ritual contexts. And here we come to an interesting magical crossroads in this reasoning and story. How do homosexual activities work in a so-called sexual dynamic polarity? The answer is in exactly the same way as during heterosexual congress. There may be an initial sexual confusion for outsiders on the energy level, meaning there are two men or two women having sex. But what all still boils down to is that two distinctly different energies have to meet to maximize the discharge with its inherent transcendental potential. The homosexual meeting can also in itself be transcendentally liberating if you look at it in the context of, for instance, a prejudiced or condemning surrounding. In that conflict, there is also a diametrical challenge that can be overcome and used creatively. Crowley formulated this magical principle in the term Babalon. Going back to the romantic notion of the whore of Babylon in the so-called revelations of the Christian Bible, he created an attractive, rebellious principle that appealed both to his own fantasies and to women with a need to free themselves from patriarchal stereotypes. But the term contains much more than his own poetic definitions of personal preferences. The Babalon concept is a central part of the sex magical teachings and techniques within the O.T.O. and also within other organizations. The formula I mentioned earlier, 2 equals 0, is an important key to this. Two parts, or rather two poles, make possible a temporary setting free of energy in transcendence, which can be used in ritual contexts. But it's far too easy to get stuck in stereotypes or stagnant concepts in which rebellious archetypes quickly become reactionary. One clear example of an intellectually based sadomasochism that was typical of Crowley exists in Leah Hersig's Oath to Crowley during the early 1920s at Cefalù, where Crowley had created an abbey of Thelema, a monastery of sorts where Thelemites could develop themselves. Hersig was one of Crowley's main scarlet women, or magical partners, and they worked ritually together, imbued by the Babalon concept and inspired by the force set free in their sexual escapades. Quote, "I dedicate myself wholly, without stint, to the great work. I will raise myself in pride. I will follow Rahur Kuit in his way. I will work the way of wickedness. I will kill my heart. I will be loud and adulterous. I will be covered with jewels and rich garments. I will be shameless before all men. I, for token thereof, will freely prostitute my body to the lusts of each and every living creature that shall desire it. I claim the title Mystery of Mysteries, Babalon the Great and the number 156, and the robe of the woman of whoredoms and the cup of abominations. Witness mine hand, Alostrael." End quote. The question now becomes, how much of this is A, a genuinely intuitive yet willed magical formulation, B, Crowley's sexual fantasies, or C, Hersig's own sexual fantasies? Crowley's life is undoubtedly a story of complex relationships to both men and women, sexually as well as emotionally. It's easy to criticize too harshly and claim that he used people financially and sexually. But at the same time, we mustn't forget that his work as a philosopher and author shows a considerably more altruistic, albeit distinctly post-Nietzschean side that encourages all men and women's undeniable potential and right to individual liberty. Crowley is certainly not alone in creating a great pathos of freedom and benevolence on a theoretical plane, while he himself at times had obvious problems with the implementation on practical levels. Aleister Crowley was a child of his time, whose emotional cluster was built on a hatred of his upbringing in general and of his mother in particular. His integration of a feminine sexual role in the homosexual contexts and a rough dominant masculine role in the heterosexual contexts seem to indicate some kind of dissolution of core identity. As these behaviors were integrated before his magical awakenings and initiations, we must suppose that these later integrations of the roles as distinct magical energies to a great extent were post facto constructions, albeit very creative and usable ones. Crowley was a genuine researcher who unfortunately quite often drifted into either benevolent hedonism or malevolent addiction. And it's perfectly legitimate to ask oneself whether his own experienced shortcomings were turned into virtues to make a necessity of. I'm thinking both of his flamboyant bisexuality and his abuse of drugs. Maybe the related stigma at the time was easier to deal with on a personal, emotional level if he created an intricate raison d'être which turned both these areas into constructive building blocks in a personal, magical universe. I have a hard time believing that the specifically transcendental aspects of both these traits were used or integrated by him fully, all the time, and totally consciously. This entire reasoning also leads to a metaphysical speculation about the need for development. If the distinctly magical, that is, the potentially supra-creative, lies in the discharge between diametrical poles, then routine-based normal polarities should eventually become dissolved or weakened. A concrete example of this could be a human relationship that is diminishing after the sexual element within the relationship has weakened. Crowley's Babalon concept is not built upon the assumption that all women must be loose or emancipated on terms dictated by certain men. It is rather based on rebellion within context. Everything that moves on in routine is eventually weakened and loses its right to exist. The stereotypical image of the Babalon archetype that we can see in the lust card in the Thoth tarot deck, for instance, and within the global Thelemic community with a naked woman straddling a lion is far from as controversial today as it was a century or even longer ago. The sexual neurosis and bad trips of the biblical authors for a long time created enormous possibilities for magical work inside the sexual dynamic polarity and provocation. There and then, the Scarlet Woman was a potent symbol of emancipation. And the more rigid and strict the conventions, the easier to rebel and thereby set free energy for magical purposes. And this leads on to the question, what or who is Babalon today? I don't think it's feminists with bright neon hair colors and hundreds of university degrees in gender studies, nor is it politically correct net-based hipsters and social media rabulists and fabulists who usually, paradoxically, are completely intolerant towards anyone with a divergent point of view. A Babalon today, as always, is simply the person who dares defy the current norms of hegemonies, regardless if they exist on private, sexual planes or general existential ones. The opposition you encounter within a restrictive sphere is the actual tool that can liberate enormous energies in favor of your own creativity and success. And this also leads on to an important aspect that must never be forgotten. We all exist within individual contexts. Crowley's Thelema philosophy is about individualism, about an enlightened egoism in which you assume a responsibility for your own life and your own choices. All collective processes eventually lead to philosophical and moral stagnation. Unfortunately, it's in the unenlightened human nature to proceed and advance at the cost of others. What could be easier than to hide behind a group or a collective ideal and become a spokesperson for other basically free individuals without asking for permission first? Regardless if you're a man or a woman or something else, and no matter what you fight for, I think it's important to remember that you are only you. That personal sphere in itself is an enormous responsibility. And perhaps it is therefore fitting to end with a quote from the Duke of Wellington. Noli affaire verba latina, dic quod habes dicendum deinde concide, or don't quote in Latin. Say what you have to say and then sit down. Thank you for being here and listening to my talk on Aleister Crowley. If you would like to read this text, it has been published in my book called Occult, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. Please also check out my other video lectures here at Vimeo. And if you want to support my work, please consider joining the Patreon I have together with my wife, artist and psychoanalyst Vanessa Sinclair. In the information text for this recording, you can also find many links of relevance that will take you to other expressions of my work. Again, thank you for being here, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye.